Good evening, all. I didn't buy my own book, but I need it. Because recently I have been, as Jason said, this is actually the second book. I'm still trying to finish the third, which concerns my friendships, my relationships with survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So at this point, I know more about Japan than I do about my own grandmother. But I had a lot of fun with this book a couple of years ago. I always knew my grandparents had a good relationship, but this was just icing on the cake. This was richer. This was more. I got to hear them talk. My grandparents met, and there's a little background for this. My grandparents met when my grandfather was 6 and my grandmother was 5. In Sunday school, in Presbyterian Sunday school. My great-grandmother Truman was a Baptist, but what she called Lightfoot Baptist. A little dancing in the and she apparently wasn't too picky about where the kids went to Sunday school as long as the preacher knew what he was doing. And she discovered that the Presbyterian preacher in Independence knew what he was doing, so she took Grandpa over for an interview. He was 6 years old, and while my great-grandmother was talking to the minister, my grandfather was staring across the room at this little golden-haired girl with big blue eyes. At the age of 6, he was gawping at her. And as far as anybody knows, he never looked at another woman. There's no record anywhere that my grandfather took an interest in anyone else but my grandmother. That did not work in reverse. At least at first. My grandmother paid him no mind at all. They went to school together. They went through kindergarten, grade school, high school together. They were friendly. They occasionally wound up in the same social situations, but not very often. They were from different sides of the tracks. My grandmother, of course, her grandfather, George Porterfield Gates, was one of the richest men in town, co-owner of the Wagner Gates Milling Company, queen of the pantry flour, built that big house in Independence, or built most of it anyway. He started with a small one and made it bigger. And Grandpa was, his family were farmers, farmers and traders eventually in town. But they were from different social systems and didn't get together very often. They were also very different kids. My grandfather, for all, grew up to be known as a tough president, a tough man. Got up early in the morning, went for a walk, kept himself in shape. But as a small child, no. He was a skinny little kid. He wore big, thick glasses. My great-grandparents took him to a 4th of July celebration in Independence when he was 6 years old. At the end of the day, my great-grandmother was looking, the fireworks are going off over here, and Grandpa was looking over here somewhere. And they took him to the eye doctor, and the doctor said he's got flat eyeballs. Which doctors don't tell you that anymore. He was extremely farsighted. And he wore thick glasses the rest of his life. He didn't play sports. My grandmother, on the other hand, it was said could throw a ball like a boy, overhand, hard. She was a demon golf player. She played golf. She played tennis. During their courtship later on, in fact, Grandpa played into this love of tennis and actually rolled part of his farm fields flat into a grass court to see if she'd come out and play on it. She never did. It was a waste of a lot of work. So she was a different, and years later in the White House, and I love this story, a New York Times photographer named George Thames told me this story. Apparently, in the White House, during an intimate dinner, Clark Clifford told me this story. The Cliffords and my grandparents and 2 other couples were having just a little 8-person sit-down dinner in the family dining room in the White House, and they were talking about sports. And my grandfather smiled and said, well, Mrs. Truman was a college champion. And my grandmother said, shut up, Harry. And of course, Clifford couldn't let it go. After a couple more minutes, he said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Truman, I have to ask, what was your sport?" And my grandmother wouldn't answer. She just stared at her plate. And my grandfather smiled and said, "Shot put." My grandmother put the shot at the Barstow Finishing School. I didn't know the finishing school taught young ladies the shot put. But she had, and it was said, in addition to the shot put, she also had a mean uppercut. You did not get in a fight with Bess Truman. So they were opposites in so many ways. Well, after they parted ways at high school, they did not see each other for a while, and their lives took different turns. My grandfather held a variety of jobs, helping the family out. He was timekeeper on a railroad for a while. He went to Spalding College for a while to learn some skills, bookkeeping skills. He eventually wound up in a bank. Wound up in a bank in downtown Kansas City, where he might have stayed had not the family farm needed him, and he went to work on his mother's family farm out there in Grandview for the next 12 years. My grandmother, on the other hand, that was a tragic time for her and her family. Her father, David Willett Wallace, was one of the most popular men, if not the most popular guy in Independence. He was a truly nice man who, it was said, would give you the shirt off his back. He was always helping people. He was always friendly. He aspired to a political career, and he had some minor appointments. He did okay, but he never made it to the level he wanted to, and he never made a lot of money, which was embarrassing for him because his father-in-law, George Porterfield Gates, never thought he would ever make a lot of money. He didn't think he would be a good provider for his daughter, Madge Gates Wallace. And it was even worse for David because to help keep Madge and his family, which by this time was my grandmother and her 3 younger brothers, to help keep them in the style to which he thought they ought to be accustomed, which they deserved, he was borrowing heavily, including from his father-in-law. And it finally got to David. He was never a temperate man. And the drinking got worse and worse and worse as his finances and his life got worse. And finally, one morning in 1903, he went upstairs, and he got up one morning, got fully dressed, and went into the bathroom and put a gun to his head. My grandmother was devastated because David was everything to her. He was in many ways a great father. He was one of those guys who you have the sense that we say today that he was in touch with his inner child. I think David was. He was fun to be around. He was a good guy. He was close to his kids. They loved him. And my grandmother was heartbroken and, I think, really, really angry with him for leaving her and leaving the family like that. There's her friend Mary Paxton went over to the house after they found out that my great-grandfather killed himself and looked for my grandmother to comfort her, and she found my grandmother in the backyard simply walking back and forth, pacing with her fists tightly balled at her sides. She wouldn't say a word. She was just walking back and forth, and all Mary could do was walk with her until she wanted to quit. So she was very, very angry at David. Grandpa, in the meantime, did not come back into her life. This was 1903. Grandpa did not come back into her life until 1910. By this time, he was working the farm. He came into Independence every once in a while to visit his cousins, the Nolans, who lived across the street from the Wallace house, the Gates Wallace house. And he was over there one day when his aunt said that there was a cake plate that needed to go back over to Mrs. Wallace. And my mother always described this moment as my grandfather moving with something approaching the speed of light. He grabbed the cake plate and ran it across the street and rang the bell, hoping that my grandmother would answer the door. And she did. Well, the guy on her doorstep was not the skinny, little, bespectacled Harry Truman she'd known in grade school and high school. He still had the spectacles, but this is a guy who had been working outside for a couple of years on a farm, dealing with animals, dealing with tractors, dealing with equipment. He was windburned, he was tan. He'd also started drilling with the National Guard, and he was ramrod straight. He put on about 20 pounds of muscle. And so she opened the door and went, Oh. And when he asked her, he came in and they spent a little time together, and when he asked her if he could write to her, she said, yes. And he did, and that's what started their courtship they courted for the next 9, I don't believe I didn't turn that off. Just so you all know, my wife said her workout was great. And she will kill me for sharing that with you. Won't she, Jane? Jane, Tom better know my wife, I'm dead. Anyway, so they began that courtship that only ended with their marriage after World War I, when Grandpa went into business with his former staff sergeant, Eddie Jacobson, in basic training in the haberdashery. Since we're at the archives, and coming down here and thinking about this, archivists love my grandfather because he never, ever threw away a scrap of paper. He kept everything. He kept bills. If you want to know what Harry Truman paid for gas in 1926 at an Esso station, you can find it somewhere. He saved receipts, he saved canceled checks, he saved notes, he saved letters. He saved everything. And especially he held on to it after he became president, because keeping in mind that someday he wanted a presidential library, and he wanted us, American people, to have a record of what was going on in the head of their president. What makes them tick? Why do they do what they do? So he wanted everything he could get his hands on. My grandmother, on the other hand, had not been president of the United States and didn't think we needed to know a damn thing about her business. My grandfather came home one day in 1955, near Christmas time, the House of Independence, and he found my grandmother. The Truman Library has 1,360 letters that my grandfather wrote to my grandmother between 1910 and 1959. Just personal letters. We have 184 of my grandmother's back to him. Because on that day in 1955, my grandfather found my grandmother in front of the fireplace, burning stacks of her letters. And he said, "Bess, for God's sake, stop. What are you doing? Think of history." And she said, "Oh, I have." And kept throwing in the letters. It wasn't, this was her private life. She wasn't, these letters, the ones that we have, the 184 we have that are in the book, escaped. She just, Ray Gesselbrock at the Truman Library called it poor housekeeping. She stuck them in the drawer, in backs of drawers. She stuck them in books as bookmarks. She lost track of them. She found them, they'd be gone. And when they did find them, and when I finally got a hold of them, my mother was a good daughter. She respected my grandmother's wish to not publish these letters. And then my mother passed away, and they became the property of my grandmother's rotten grandson, who basically saw a good bit of history and a very good story, and figured that enough time had passed and that her reputation could take it. They do not sully her reputation at all, these letters. The Bess Truman that I knew was 80-some years old. And she was very nice, as long as you didn't cross her. By putting marbles down the heating grate, climbing on the roof, breaking her dishes, any number of things that I might have done. But she was an 80-year-old lady. So I did not know the 38-year-old Bess Truman, the 40-year-old Bess Truman, the 45-year-old Bess Truman. The letters, which were interesting to me, and this was a total fluke considering how they were found in drawers and in books, there's actually a linear progression here. They basically run from 1923, which was just before he did his first term as judge in Jackson County, to 43, on the eve of his being nominated vice president. So this is the 20 years leading up to the presidency. This is his formative years as a politician. And the letters are, they were an interesting mix to me of just personal tidbits, mundane stuff, day-to-day. They're talking to each other about the day-to-day stuff. With a mix of politics thrown in. You've got the backdrop of it. My grandfather investigating waste and fraud and military spending during World War II, investigating the railroads before that. So he's talking about flying all over the country and investigating all this waste and fraud and all these things that are changing the country and harming the country. And she's talking about his slippers and the notepaper and what they need, how many new car mats they need to buy, and what kind should they get. So it's a really interesting mix of stuff. One of the things, the first letter I read was from 1923. And the interesting thing about the first letters in 1923, even 4 years into their marriage, they had apparently not settled on names for each other, nicknames. Now, if the book is called Dear Harry, Love Bess, that's how most of the letters are signed. But in the early going, you have a little bit of variety here. My dear wife, and then she calls him dear old sweetness. Where that was going, there was one I loved in here. Friend, husband, my dear wife, my dear Bess. It begins to settle down. It begins to settle down. But then the honey, there's a couple of honeys in here. And the one I always like, dear Petty. I don't know, and that's from her to him. So Grandpa was apparently petty. And I can hear him spinning in his grave right now. But I read that out loud in Jefferson City. But that was the first letter I got my hands on, was the Dear Petty one from July 15 and 16, 1923, written from Independence, Missouri. Grandpa was off at National Guard camp, and that's where most of these letters from the 20s and early 30s were back and forth between Independence, where my grandmother was taking care of the house, and my grandfather was off at National Guard training for a couple of weeks, a week or two every summer. But the first thing that she says, it is now 10:20 and I am in bed. There was a big black bug on my bed when I turned the sheet down, and I had to kill it myself. But that wasn't the first time I wished for you. Yeah, see, there's stuff in here the grandchildren probably shouldn't read. They really, there's another one, and I'll have to find it, I will at some point here. There's another one that she got up, I love it, she got up really, really early in the morning to watch her neighbors leave on vacation, because she said that she wouldn't miss seeing the neighbor lady in knickers for $100. She had, and one of the things that really struck me about this, we were talking, Jason and I were talking a bit outside, talking with some of you folks that I've been outside about, Facebook and Twitter and texts and emails. That's how we all communicate these days, given my wife's workout news there and things like that. But they wrote twice a day, letters. Full letters, and sometimes they'd start one in the morning, and then if they had something to do, they'd stop and they'd pick it up later, or they would write a separate letter because you had morning and evening post. Sometimes I'd at least 2 posts a day, so that they could send out 2 letters a day, and both of them got really cranky if they didn't get a letter from the other one, and they would nag each other. Here she writes though. I just had your Thursday letter, she said on July 19, 1923. Had been sitting at the front window waiting for the postman for hours. Oh good, some of these are bad as I am. No problem. I did it first. It wasn't you ringing, okay, then I've thrown you under the bus and you give me it. And then Grandpa came right back with a response letter. I sure raised sand with the adjutant yesterday morning when I didn't get a letter. But it came in the afternoon, and boy, how nice it was. They got up early, and they stayed up late to write letters. Writing letters even got into my grandmother's dreams. She says, I was powerfully glad to get your special late last night. She writes this on July 22nd, 1923. And then I dreamed that I got still another one, which was very nice, as long as it lasted. If she missed sending a letter, they were very thorough with their excuses. My grandmother, this is like one run-on sentence almost. I was so delighted to get that special this morning, it made me sick not to have sent yours that way yesterday, but there wasn't anybody here who could take it to the post office. Frank and Fred were both gone all day, and I just felt like I could not make it uptown and back, and I didn't have no stamps at home. Sorry it's like to be that you won't even have a piece of a letter today, for I know how much you would have missed mine. That alone took me half an hour to transcribe from her handwriting. And if she didn't have a thorough excuse, and here's another one of those interesting excuses, it was so blazing hot last night, I didn't have the nerve to keep on enough clothes so I could have a light long enough to write a letter. So then, you know, the kind of stuff that you don't often hear from Harry and Bess Truman. But she was politics. Just as I have to tell this story, just as an aside, this does not have to do with the letters, but about, you know, reading about your grandparents' love life, knowing about your grandparents' love life, even knowing that it existed. I mean, I'm here, so it must have. There was a story that I think it was David McCullough had in his book, in Truman, that they were living in Blair House, which was my grandfather's second administration, and they couldn't live in the White House because it was being completely gutted and repaired. And my grandmother had been away, and some of that, the reasons for going come through in these letters. You know, she was really in the middle of a tug of war between her own mother and my grandfather. He's stuck in Washington, and Madge is back in Independence, saying, you know, when are you coming home? Because apparently, ever since my great-grandmother's suicide, my grandmother had been Madge's support. She had been her emotional support. She had run the family. She had taken care of her younger brothers. So Madge relied on her a lot and was completely shameless about, you know, trying to get her back from Washington. And my grandfather, the same way, wandering around the White House by himself, you know, wondering why, you know, come on back here, I need you here. So she really was stuck in the middle. But so she had gone back to Independence from Blair House she'd been gone for a couple of months. And they did not like being apart. I got a real sense of that from these letters. They understood the necessity of it, but they were much happier together, very comfortable with each other, very happy in each other's presence. So she'd been gone for 2 months, and when she came back, the atmosphere, it was palpable. Everybody was in a good mood. It went to the staff. Everybody was happy. Everybody was thrilled. Grandpa was in a great mood. My grandmother was in a great mood. Everybody went to bed that night. My grandmother came down the next morning and found the head usher and said, it was Mr. Fields, and said, Mr. Fields, we have a little problem that we need to, upstairs we have a little, oh hell, Fields, one of the slats on the bed is broken. So, very happy in each other's company. My grandmother, it was said about my grandmother that she didn't really like politics, and that's why she was always leaving and going back to Independence, which, as I said, was not true. She did like politics. She didn't like, you know, mucking around in it herself on a daily basis, but she loved to hear about it from my grandfather, and she did dabble in it occasionally as a judge's wife, as a senator's wife, and as first lady. But her involvement started early. There was a time period in 1926 when before Grandpa ran for presiding judge, he was Eastern judge from 22 to 24. Then he lost the election in 24, and he stayed out of office for 2 years. One presiding judge in 26 and again in 30. And those were his 8 major years on the Jackson County Court. But while he was out of office, he's getting ready to run again, and Tom Pendergast, the boss of the Democrat boss of Jackson County, had been grooming him, and they're getting ready for this. So when an attorney named J. Allen Pruitt asked my grandfather, my grandpa's away here, so my grandmother's the only one home. And Pruitt is asking him through her, if he would serve on a couple of committees for an event in support of a U.S. Senate candidate named Harry B. Hawes of St. Louis. She sensed the conflict, and she called Pendergast's office and was told by Pendergast folks that Grandpa should stay out of all fights, they called it. Stay out of this one. This is not a good thing to get in the middle of. So my grandmother promptly called Pruitt back and lied to him, and just said that Grandpa would be home for camp in time for the event, and she didn't think that Hawes had much of a chance with Pruitt in his corner anyway. So she would take part. She would take part, and she had the opinions are in the letters. So she had an active role in his career. She was interested. She liked to hear about it. She liked talking about it. She had an opinion on it. Very often, a pretty astute opinion. So there's the mundane. There's taking care of my mother, and there's also politics in this. The one from 1923. There were two running conversations that go here. I paired all these with, as I said, with Grandpa's letters, so you have them talking back and forth to each other. Because when I first heard my grandmother's letters, she would say things, and I go, well, why in the hell did she say that? And I have to go back and find, like, for example, she said, you want your slippers? In one letter, she said, you want your slippers? And I'm like, why is she sending him slippers to the National Guard camp? Well, because he'd asked for them. He had to walk, he had to slog down a boardwalk with mud and rain, to get to the communal showers from his tent. So she thought he might need slippers. But during 1923, the big thing going through 1923 was that she had to have teeth removed. And apparently it was not as much fun as it is today. And she wrote several letters to him, and she was a little, she could be a little acerbic about the dentist, because apparently he picked a day, what did she say? She said he picked a day when the dentist, Dr. Berry, initially put off removing that tooth in July of 1923 because he said he wanted to consult a colleague. My grandmother figured that he was just waiting for, quote, someday when it rains, I reckon, and he can't play golf. So she wasn't too sure that he was taking very good care of her. She said the last letter from that sequence is, and this was on this was late July, July 24th, Tuesday afternoon, 1923, and she reports the tooth is out, and it's a good thing. Dr. B said it was much worse than he expected. The X-ray doesn't even show the abscess in the middle of the tooth. He had a pretty bad time getting it out. It had to be cut and drilled out entirely. It took him 1 hour and 5 minutes to do it. He was as worn out as I was. But it isn't bothering me much now. He had to give me so many hypodermics, my head feels funny. And then there's some talk of syringes and pus, which I didn't even understand. So they were very thorough in all of their conversations with each other. And there was one other one that I loved. And one thing is about my grandfather that they talked about this, that haircuts. Apparently, I'm sure none of us will remember this, but the style was for shorter hair in the 1920s. And my grandmother wanted to get a haircut, and my grandfather didn't want her to. He liked the long golden curls that he had seen as a 6-year-old and still remembered. And I'm going to lose that year. The whole year is gone. And here's one thing that I always liked. There's a guy that when he was going to camp in 1927. This says something about the difference in the way they dealt with people. They both liked people, but my grandfather was very. He was very open with people. He trusted people. He was willing to overlook faults. My grandmother was not. she was a bit suspicious, and she was a little harder on people. So he's gone off to National Guard camp in 1927, and he's gotten a flat. We arrived on schedule just in time to take a bath and have our noonday meal here at Fort Riley. We'd have been about 40 minutes earlier, but for a nail in the right front tire at Manhattan. It happened right in town and only 1 block from a garage, or we'd have been in a nice fix because there was no jack in the car. I shall probably unburden my sentiments to friend Oliver when I return. If he had my job and I his, I'd expect a good going over under the same circumstances, and I'd probably get it. Because Mr. Oliver had lent him the car and forgot to put the jack in the car. So he writes that to my grandmother, and my grandmother comes back and says, yes, I think Mr. Oliver ought to hear about it, but you'll calm down before you get home, and he'll never know anything about it. Maybe it'd be a good idea to say nothing and let the same thing happen to him. And hope for the worst. That's the Christian spirit, huh? So she knew he wouldn't do it. She knew he wasn't going to, because he won't. He would let things go by, and he would be nice to people. And it made my grandmother a little nuts. One of the things that I saw that it doesn't have so much to do with their letters as about Grandpa's character. And I don't know if you've all seen it. Occasionally, somebody sends around the internet a piece about Grandpa that has, it talks about how much money Bill Clinton has made in retirement, how much money Ford has made in retirement. And then it talks about Grandpa refusing all of these jobs. He was offered, seats on boards of 6, 7 banks or corporations, and turned them all down because he said, you don't want me, you want the office of the presidency, and that's not for sale. So he turned all of that down. I joke, I've always had to work for a living. I wouldn't have to if he'd just been a little more dishonest. But he turned all of that down, and he wound up okay, but he struggled. But here, this is from 1933, and of course, working in the Pendergast machine, he was it almost as far as honest, straightforward guys. Not to smear everybody else in the machine, but he was really dealing with a lot of crooked people. And one of the reasons that he went off to National Guard camp, and I learned this only through the letters. Again, we think of Harry Truman as a hale and healthy and hearty guy. He was getting headaches, heart palpitations. He was completely stressed out from dealing with crooks. But he kept on the straight and narrow. He wrote to my grandmother in May of 1933. Just because, he's getting near the end of the judge's term, and they're thinking he's going to run for collector, county collector, which might have been fine. He might have wound up as county collector. But he writes to my grandmother, Dear Bess, tomorrow I'll be 49, and for all the good I've done, 40 might as well be left off. Take it all together, though the experience has been worthwhile. I'd like to do it again. I've been in a railroad, bank, farm, war, politics, love, only once, and it still sticks. Been busted and still am, and yet I have stayed an idealist. I still believe that my sweetheart is the ideal woman, and that my daughter is her duplicate. I think that for all the horrors of war, it still makes a man if he's one to start with. Politics should make a thief, a roue, and a pessimist of anyone, but I don't believe I'm any of them. And if I get the Kansas City courthouse done without scandal, no other judge will have done as much, and then maybe I can retire as collector, and you and the young lady can take some European and South American tours where they'll do you the most good. Or maybe we'll go live in Washington and see all the greats and near greats in action. We'll see. I'm counting the days till I see you. He always worried that he had not done enough, he had not made enough, he had not, he even suggested maybe he should have been taking bribes, because it was just so hard for him. He cut everybody's salary when he built the courthouse, and quoted another bond issue. He halved everybody's salary, including his own. And worse than that, he had my mother's allowance. He cut it from 50 cents to 25, but then undermined himself by slipping her an extra quarter every now and then, which didn't do any good at all. But all in all, again, this was for me, this was a lot of fun. I stumbled on, again, they called me after my mother passed away in 2008. I didn't know that any of these existed, except for a very small exhibit at the Truman Library in 1998. And when Mom died, and the library called me, Ray Gesselbach called me. She passed away in February, and he called me in like May or June and said, there's a bunch of letters here from your grandmother that have never been published. And like I said, the light bulb went off, and I immediately turned into a rotten grandchild. I will leave you. We've planned some time for question and answer, but I'll leave you with one last letter, one that I ended the book with, was one that my grandmother sent to a friend of hers. I always forget this poor lady's name, so I'm going to have to go and read it again. This is a letter, Nellie Post, that wrote about Nellie. She wrote to Mrs. Kenneth Boston, Mary Boston. My grandfather hated long hair on men. Could not stand. The 60s were just the worst time for my grandfather. There's a story of the man who walked up to him on the street one day, had long hair, and walked up and he said, "Good afternoon, Mr. President." My grandfather shook his hand and said, "Young man, you look a lot better if you saw a barber." When my brother and I went to see him when I was not long before he died, my hair was down on my shoulders, and so was my brother's. And we went past the study. We forgot to say hi to Grandpa. Just went past the study and up the stairs. And Grandpa couldn't believe his eyes. He got up and he went to the door of the study. When my mother came through from the kitchen, he said, "Who are the two long hairs walking through there?" And she said, "Those are your grandsons." And he said, "Get them down here." They didn't say hello. So she dragged us downstairs again, stood us in front of Grandpa, and I said, "Hi, Grandpa." And he said, "What?" And I said, "I just came to say hello." And he said, "Well, do it then." So I said, "Hello." And he said, "Hello yourself." Did the same thing to my brother, turned on his heel and went back into his study. He was not happy. 2 years after he passed away, my grandmother came to stay with us in Washington, where we were living at the time. And by this time, my hair had grown to where I could tuck it in my front shirt pocket here. And I came down to breakfast, and my grandmother was sitting in the breakfast nook, and my mother was over making bacon and eggs for one of my brothers. And I sat down, and my grandmother looked at me and said in a loud voice, "My goodness, you have beautiful hair." And my mother screamed and dropped the spatula. And whirled around and said, "Mother, for God's sake, don't tell him something like that. He'll never get it cut." And sure enough, after my grandmother went home, my mother said, "You look a little better with just that." Bess Truman likes my hair. So years go by. I tell this story to the Truman Library over and over and over, and they finally gave me, in laminated plastic, they gave me this letter that my grandmother wrote to Mrs. Boston. And in it says that they talk about Key West and they talk about some other stuff. And in it they say, she finally says, "It's too bad Nellie Post is having all that trouble with those hippies. It seems that something should be done about it. When I saw my two grown grandsons with long hair, I nearly expired. Thank God they were clean and had on good clothing." So it turned out that my grandmother hated long hair every bit as much as my grandfather, but she was willing to overlook that just to annoy my mother. Folks, you have been a lovely audience. Questions? Anybody? Yes, sir.
Have you heard or do you know the circumstance that caused the president to use the words, "The buck stops here"?
Do I know the circumstance that caused him to use the words, "The buck stops here"? I thought that was a sign made for him by prisoners. at one of the penitentiaries, and that's where it came from. It was his attitude, and they just gave him a sign. I don't know that he ever said it. It came, unfortunately, it came on a placard. Now you've got me curious now, but that's the story that I heard, was that somebody, because that was his attitude, because the buck did stop with him. But I don't know that he ever said it until somebody got him that sign. And there's a guy, I can check this because I've been corresponding with email with a man who's actually writing about this, about the penitentiary, about the sign, about my grandfather. So I'll have to send him an email and say, okay, I obviously haven't been reading your emails. Tell me the story, but I'll find out. So I think that's what it is. Yes.
Well, the question of all the other letters that I guess Harry wrote to Bess, have they all been transcribed and published?
They have about half of them. Bob Farrell wrote a book, Dear Bess, in 1985, I think it was, 84, 85, when the letters first became public. He wrote it. He used about half of them, 600 or 700 letters. So those have been transcribed. I'm not sure that the others have been transcribed. I know the library has them because in this book I had to use some of the letters that Farrell used because they matched up with my grandmother's. But every place that I could, I used a letter that had not yet been published. And I had to transcribe it, which was a lot of work because both of them, and they both have the same teacher, so their handwriting, it's not like reading a text message. But yeah, so I don't think they formally transcribed all of it. Yes?
You mentioned that your grandfather chose not to capitalize on being president by being on well-paid boards, but he did okay. What did he do after?
There was some trouble right there. He left the presidency with no salary. They did not give ex-presidents a pension. The apocryphal story is, it might be true, they voted, one of the reasons they voted him a pension is because they found that he'd been buying and licking his own stamps. So he'd been paying, he got an advance for his memoirs, a rather hefty advance, some $600,000 to write his memoirs, which you'd think would be great, but he had to pay researchers, he had to rent office space in downtown Kansas City, and at that time, it was kind of as I understand, kind of a mean-spirited thing that was done to him. The taxes were outrageous because when President Eisenhower wrote his memoirs, they changed the law. And I don't want to blame the Republicans, but somebody had, and I don't think it was just the Republicans, somebody had it in for him and just made it hard for him. So he wound up with total net out of that $600,000, he had a profit of $35,000. He and my grandmother and his brother and sister sold the family farm in Grandview, 600 acres, to developers, and that's what finally paid all the bills off, and frankly, put his grandchildren through college. So, what investments I have today started with a nugget given me by my grandfather, who very smart, made the trust come due in subsequent years as I got older and older and older. Don't give it to him when he was 18, you'll never see it again. Yes?
Do you remember that story when Harry and Bess were taking their one driving trip back to the East Coast? The highway patrolman pulled them over and he realized who he was. And Bess said to Harry, head to the highway patrolman, you go ahead and give him the ticket, I'll keep an eye on him the rest of the way.
That's better than what I heard actually happened. It was my grandfather who told him, go ahead, you give me a ticket, you do your job, and the guy did. I like it better your way. I once, with Ray Gesselbach, I mentioned a couple times, the Truman Library, when I first started doing this, I got very nervous, because, am I getting it right? I don't want to be up here as his grandson and be messing up stories. But Ray finally told me, he said, hell, you're his grandson, you say whatever you want.
Somewhere out there was their handle, so they stopped at this dairy queen to get an ice cream. And the girl realized who was. She said, would you mind waiting here? I just live across the street. I want to come over and take a picture. So he did.
Yeah, well, and it was kind of there's a whole book on that written by a guy that I met while he was researching it. Matthew Algeo wrote Harry Truman's Excellent Adventure, basing it on the Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure movie title. But he's written a very nice book about that whole trip across country and some of the problems that it caused. You know, we had the ex-president driving himself across the United States.
And the other thing was, reporters would follow him and they'd go back in the restaurant and see how much of a tip he got.
Well, that's just good reporting. Yes?
Do you remember any traditions like at Christmas or anything and get-togethers with maybe relatives your age?
There were no relatives my age. My parents were only children.
Did you get any Christmas special things you would do at Christmas? Like put the pickle under the tree or something like that?
That's another good one I'm going to have to remember. Huh?
That's an old German tradition.
Oh, it is? Okay, well, then we Scots-Irish missed it all the way. No, I remember the one story I will tell you about Christmas out of Independence. When I was 5 or 6 years old, I became fascinated. I think it was the Macy's parade in New York. I became fascinated with the band uniforms, with the plumes and the hats and the buttons and the braid. And I told my parents that I wanted a band uniform for Christmas. Well, you know, that's the kind of thing that just makes parents nuts. They're like, great, we're going to get a band uniform. And so my father and mother mentioned this to my grandfather. We were coming out here for Christmas that year. And I was hoping band uniform. I did not get the band uniform, but my grandfather had somehow managed to find me a completely authentic, miniaturized Marine sergeant's dress uniform. And it was hanging, they had displayed it on the wall of the House of Independence, complete with the hat. And looking back, I don't think they got that at a costume store. It's probably left over from a very small Marine. But it was accurate, it was complete. But I was delighted with it anyway. And there's a picture somewhere of me at Christmas and it fits perfectly, meaning I only wore it once. But there's a picture of me with that uniform on, my head tilted back, blowing a toy trumpet. So, but that, having an ex-president as your grandfather for Christmas is not a bad idea. But we came out. That's the only Christmas that I actually remember out here, because there were no special traditions that I've been, and no pickles, unfortunately. Okay, nobody over here? Yes, go ahead. You go again.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned some disagreement about whether your grandmother should have her hair cut. Was this the process they call bobbing your hair?
Yes. Yeah, it was the 20s, and she wanted it short.
It's a famous debate among couples of that era.
Yeah.
The women all wanted it short, and the men...
Well, apparently in the book, she goes back and forth several times, because apparently the fight started before he went for National Guard camp. They started it face-to-face, because when the letters start up, it's like, oh, come on, let me get my hair cut. Everybody's doing it. Your cousins had their hair cut. They're teachers. That made a difference. So she's trying to talk him into it, and he hems and haws a little bit. Finally, he says what every good husband should say, go ahead and do what you want. You're going to anyway. And I will love you no matter. So it's finally what he winds up saying, but even after he says that, she comes back again and says, come on, let me do it. So I don't know what's going on. Apparently there's a letter missing in there somewhere.
Do you know if she did it then?
I don't, and I don't, but I think she did, because her, you don't see her with long hair much after the 20s. And she wore it up, but then pictures of her, it's short. And when I knew her, it was blue. So. Yes.
I actually have a Hollywood-related question on my, when Lauren McCall passed, just a month or so ago, couldn't help myself, the picture I had to post was the one of your grandfather playing the piano and her perched on that. The story I heard is she kind of interjected herself in that situation, and but your grandmother was kind of nonplussed about it.
Grandmother, she would not have approved, which is why, if you look at the pictures of Grandpa playing the piano with McCall on top of it, he's only half smiling. Apparently he had a big grin on his face about 2 minutes earlier, and then her agent just went, whoop, and put her up on the piano, and all Grandpa could think, of course, was, oh, great. You know, thanks a lot. Because that wasn't his image. That wasn't who he was. He didn't approve of that kind of thing. And he certainly, but, you know, I'm sure that he got home and my grandmother said something to the effect of, that was real nice. And he probably said, yeah. Because, you know, she knew him, but that just wasn't something he wanted to project, but he was trying to be, he was vice president, he was trying to go along with the program, and it just happened. There wasn't anything he could do about it. So, and so, you know, to say something snotty would not be him either, so.
I had a follow-up on that. I don't know if your grandfather or your grandmother got to see any dramatic portrayals, like James Whitmore's one-man play. Do you have any favorites yourself? Or is that a fair question?
I loved Whitmore's. I saw James Whitmore's when they first filmed it back in the, this was in the 70s. I flew with my mother and father to Greece, and actually my parents, you know, people wonder why I used to, I'm sort of over it, I used to have a real fear of flying. When you got parents who fly separately in case something happens to one of them, you begin to get the idea that maybe flying isn't safe. You know, my brother and I used to wonder, did we pick the right parent? So I'm with my mother, hoping I picked the right parent. And the Bess and Harry was the in-flight movie. And they weren't showing it. My mother, you know, sitting up with her in first class, and I said, they're showing it back in steerage. Do you want to go and see it? And my mother said, no, seen it already, several times. She went to sleep, so I went back. I really enjoyed it, and there were a couple of times that Whitmore would do a turn that I was really looking at my grandfather. I also enjoyed Kevin McCarthy doing it on stage. I saw it because he did it for years after Whitmore did it. And I really liked Gary Sinise's. The only thing wrong with that movie was that it was only 2 hours and 15 minutes from a book this thick. It could have been 6 hours. It should have been, you know, a miniseries, TV miniseries would have been better because they were missing huge chunks. I ran into Gary Sinise in Kansas City, which apparently looks a lot like Potsdam, which is why they were filming there. Who knew? Kansas City looks like Potsdam, Germany. And they had Sinise and Richard Dysart were doing, were talking about the war and all that, and Sinise is all made up to look like Grandpa. And we met and talked for a couple seconds, and he reached out and he touched the rubber nose they put on him, and then he touched my nose and said, "Ooh, yours is real." Thanks, Gary. But I thought he did a great job. He kind of looks like Grandpa anyway, without the makeup, and I didn't think they needed all that crud all over his face. But no, they did it. It was wonderful. Just wasn't enough. I was really frustrated. You had a lady, now she's looking away like, who, me?
We couldn't hear what he was asking or telling.
Oh, about the movies. My favorite people playing my grandfather. So, yes?
One of my favorite stories, of course, was your grandfather and the music critic for your mother. Did your grandmother have any remarks?
My grandmother, no. What he's talking about, Paul Hume. My mother's concert at Constitution Hall in 1950. Grandpa's oldest friend and press secretary, Charlie Ross, had died at his desk that morning. And Korea had started, and Grandpa was in a bad mood. And Hume wrote a less than stellar review of my mother's performance, and Grandpa wrote that page-and-a-half letter ending with, if I ever meet you in person, you'll need Stakes for black eyes, a new nose, and perhaps a supporter below. and he went, well, his press people wouldn't send it out, so he gave it to the head usher, to stick that in the mailbox. And apparently Hume got a hold of it and took it right to his editor, publisher, and said, look at this nasty letter I got from Harry Truman, what are we going to do? And the publisher said, put it in the drawer over there with the other nasty letters from Harry Truman. Because apparently the publisher was used to this. But Hume apparently, one of the stories is that he took it to, he went to lunch with a colleague from the paper and they found out, so he had to print it. Years ago, I gave a speech like this to a group retirement home in Evanston, Illinois, and during the question and answer, one of the ladies put her hand up, and I said, yes, ma'am, and she said, I knew Paul Hume, because he's from that area, he's from the Chicago suburbs. And I said, really? And she said, yes, I used to accompany him. And I didn't get it at first. I said, accompany him where? And she said, no. I used to play the piano for him. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. He sang? And she said, oh, yes. And I said, on behalf of my mother, I have to ask, how was he? And the lady smiled and said, like a cow mooing. I called my mother when I got home. I called my mother and I told her that, and the line went dead. And I thought it had gone dead. I said, Mom, hello, Mom. Turned out she was laughing so hard she dropped the phone. So she got a little bit of it back. But apparently, Mr. Hume was apparently a lovely man and a very good music critic, and forever scarred by this one review. Yes.
I just wanted to say that every grandmother should have a grandson like you, and I'd like to
thank you. We'll see what she thinks of my antics with the book. It's been out 3 years, and so far I have not been haunted, so I have hope. Yes?
Do you have children, and do you keep this all alive?
I do have children. I have 3. Amy, the oldest, is 27. She has moved back into our basement. But, she was on a rubber band. We let her go. She's saving some money, thinking of going back to school. She has a degree. She has a psychology degree from DePaul University, which of course qualifies her to groom dogs. She's very good at it. And I'm pretty sure it's the psychology degree. So she just didn't know what she wanted to do with the degree, and she needed a job to make money. She loves animals. She and her roommate have 3 dogs, 2 cats, 1 bunny rabbit, and a tank of fish. And occasionally they take in other dogs because they foster strays every now and then. So I was trying to write yesterday morning. I'm sitting upstairs and something set them off. It sounded like a wolf pack. But she took, she doesn't know what she wants to do. But we're glad to have her home.
Maybe a veterinarian.
Maybe. If she likes science and math, she'd be fine. And Wesley is 25. He is a working actor. He actually makes a living at this. He's worked with lyric opera. He does Shakespeare. He did Shakespeare in the Parks with Chicago Shakespeare this summer. His mother and I were very supportive, saw it 5 times. As you can take a cooler and a lawn chair. It's all outside. That was dinner every night for like 5 weekends. So he actually makes a living. He was in a national commercial. You're all familiar with Kmart, correct? There was that Shop Like a Boss ads. It didn't run for very long. It's very hot online now. The grandmother, shops online gets her stuff, pushes the button. You can reserve it at the store and go pay cash for it, so you don't need credit to do this. So grandmother does that, flips up her hoodie, puts on her dark glasses, and she's got jewelry all over like this, and she gets up with her grandson, and they go to the store, and they're doing the whole, that's Wesley. So if you Google shop like a boss, when you go home to Kmart, you will find my son dancing his way through Kmart in slow motion with an 80-year-old lady. It's actually, so he makes a living, and he loves it. He juggles, he has a great time. He had an accident last year. He was breathing fire, blew back on him, so there was some burns. He's okay, but he doesn't do that anymore. But no, and the youngest is Gates. I got a 17-year-old in high school who's, I don't know what happened. He was a cute little blonde kid. He's still a cute kid, but now he's like 6'1". He's got a beard. I don't know what, oh my God! Every time he comes home, it's like, who that? Oh, it's my son. He's huge. But and Wesley they all go to Key West with us occasionally for the historic symposiums, and they've been to the Truman Library. And Wesley has been to Japan with me twice to collect testimony stories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors. And he filmed them for me, so he's interested in the work too. So now if I could just write some letters for them to expose me with the... Yeah, right. Well, they can already read all my emails and my texts. I'm already finished.
They may be copying those.
Well, folks, you have been a wonderful audience. Thank you very much.